Maria Santos stood barely 5 feet tall in her worn-out sneakers, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. At 19, she worked double shifts at a local diner in East Los Angeles, serving coffee and cleaning tables to support her younger siblings. Most people who saw her wouldn't think twice about the quiet girl who always kept her head down and spoke in soft whispers. But Maria carried a secret that nobody at the diner knew about. Every night after her shift ended, when the last customer had left and the chairs were stacked on tables, she would walk 12 blocks to an old boxing gym tucked between a laundromat and a tire shop. The gym belonged to her uncle Ramon, a former professional boxer who had seen better days but still remembered how to throw a punch. The gym smelled of sweat, old leather, and dreams that had been beaten into submission over the years. Heavy bags hung from the ceiling like sleeping giants, and the ring in the center bore the scars of countless battles fought by hopeful fighters. This was where Maria transformed from a timid waitress into something entirely different. Ramon had started training Maria when she was just 14, after finding her crying behind the diner one evening. She had been bullied at school again, pushed around by bigger kids who thought she was an easy target. Her uncle saw something in her eyes that night, a fire that burned despite all the attempts to extinguish it. Fighting isn't about being the biggest or the strongest, Ramon had told her during their first training session. It's about having the heart to get back up when everyone expects you to stay down. For 5 years, Maria had been learning this lesson every single night. She learned to wrap her hands properly, to move her feet like a dancer, and to throw combinations that could drop opponents twice her size. Her uncle taught her to read body language, to spot weaknesses in an opponent's stance, and most importantly, to use her size as an advantage rather than a limitation. The other fighters at the gym had initially laughed when they saw Ramon working with his tiny niece. They called her Little Mouse and made jokes about her getting hurt. But as the months passed, their laughter turned to respect, and eventually to genuine fear when they sparred with her. Maria had developed a style that was uniquely her own, built around speed, precision, and an almost supernatural ability to anticipate her opponent's moves. She never spoke much during training, preferring to let her fists do the talking. While other fighters boasted about their victories or complained about their losses, Maria quietly worked on perfecting her technique. She studied videos of great fighters, practiced combinations until muscle memory took over, and pushed herself harder than anyone else in the gym. The underground fighting scene in Los Angeles was brutal and unforgiving. Fights were arranged in warehouses, abandoned buildings, and sometimes in the back rooms of bars. There were no rules, no referees, and definitely no safety nets. Fighters came from all walks of life, united only by their willingness to risk everything for a chance at money and respect. Maria had been attending these underground events for months, watching from the shadows and learning about the different fighters and their styles. She saw men and women who fought like wild animals, using every dirty trick in the book to win. She witnessed careers ended in a single night, and dreams crushed under the weight of reality. Her uncle had strictly forbidden her from participating in these underground fights. He knew the dangers involved and had seen too many promising fighters destroy their lives chasing easy money. But Maria was growing restless. The gym sparring sessions were no longer challenging enough, and she felt ready to test herself against real competition. The opportunity came on a cold Tuesday night in November. Maria was working the late shift at the diner when she overheard 2 customers talking about an upcoming underground fight. One of the scheduled female fighters had been injured in a car accident, and the organizers were desperately looking for a replacement. The fight was set for the following weekend, and the prize money was more than Maria made in 6 months at the diner. That night, after closing the diner, Maria walked to the gym with a heavy heart. She found her uncle cleaning the equipment and preparing to lock up for the night. The conversation that followed would change both of their lives forever. "I need to do this, Uncle Ramon," she said, her voice steady despite the nervousness she felt inside. "I'm ready, and you know it." Ramon looked at his niece for a long moment, seeing the determination in her eyes that reminded him of himself at her age. He had always known this day would come, when Maria would outgrow the safety of the gym and seek real challenges. He also knew that trying to stop her would only push her away, possibly into even more dangerous situations. "If you're going to do this," he said finally, "then we're going to do it right. No amateur mistakes, no unnecessary risks. You fight smart, you fight clean, and you come home in one piece." The next few days were a blur of intense preparation. Ramon contacted his old connections in the underground scene to gather information about the other fighters who would be competing. What they learned made Maria's challenge seem even more daunting. The event was being billed as a 6-woman tournament, with each fighter bringing their own unique style and background. There was Jessica "The Hammer" Martinez, a former professional boxer who had been banned from sanctioned competition for drug use. Carmen Rodriguez was a mixed martial arts fighter with a reputation for ending fights quickly and brutally. Then there was Angela Thompson, a street fighter from Detroit who had never lost an underground bout. The other 2 fighters were equally intimidating. Sarah Chen was a kickboxer who had trained in Thailand and was known for her devastating leg kicks. Finally, there was Rebecca "The Beast" Johnson, a powerlifter who had turned to fighting after being banned from competitive weightlifting for violent behavior. Each of these women had years of experience, established reputations, and physical advantages over Maria. They were bigger, stronger, and more experienced in the brutal world of underground fighting. But Maria had something they didn't expect, something that couldn't be measured in height, weight, or win-loss records. As the weekend approached, Maria felt a strange calmness wash over her. She had spent her entire life being underestimated, dismissed, and overlooked. Now, for the first time, she had a chance to show the world what she was really capable of. The warehouse stood like a forgotten monument in an industrial part of downtown Los Angeles, its broken windows and graffiti-covered walls hiding the chaos that would unfold inside. Cars began arriving after midnight, their headlights cutting through the darkness as spectators and fighters made their way to what would become one of the most talked-about underground fights in the city's history. Maria arrived with her uncle, Ramon, at exactly 1 a.m, carrying a small gym bag that contained everything she owned for fighting: hand wraps, gloves, a simple sports bra, and shorts. She wore an oversized hoodie that made her look even smaller than she actually was, and most people barely glanced at her as she walked through the crowd. Inside the warehouse, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation and danger. Makeshift bleachers had been constructed around a fighting area marked only by rope and duct tape. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, and the smell of beer and sweat created an almost suffocating environment. Men and women of all ages had gathered to witness the violence, many of them betting large sums of money on fighters they had never seen before. The organizer, a man known only as Big Mike, stood in the center of the makeshift ring wearing an expensive suit that seemed out of place in the grimy warehouse. He was a former fighter himself, now making his money by arranging these illegal events and taking a percentage of all bets placed. His reputation in the underground scene was legendary, and fighters from across the country would travel to compete in his tournaments. "Ladies and gentlemen," Big Mike announced through a crackling megaphone, "tonight we have 6 of the toughest women fighters on the West Coast, competing for a prize of $25,000. Winner takes all. No second-place prizes, no participation trophies." The crowd erupted in cheers and whistles as each fighter was introduced. Jessica "The Hammer" Martinez entered first, flexing her muscular arms and shadowboxing for the crowd. Her professional boxing background was evident in her stance and movement, and the spectators immediately recognized her as a serious contender. Carmen Rodriguez came next, performing a series of high kicks that demonstrated her martial arts training. Her lean, athletic build and cold expression suggested someone who had seen real combat and wasn't intimidated by the underground environment. Angela Thompson received the loudest cheers when she was introduced. Her undefeated record in underground fighting had made her a local legend, and many in the crowd had come specifically to watch her fight. She stood nearly 6 feet tall with arms covered in tattoos that told the story of her violent past. Sarah Chen entered with the fluid grace of a trained dancer, but her demonstration of lightning-fast kicks reminded everyone that she was a dangerous opponent. Her time training in Thailand had taught her to fight with a ruthless efficiency that had earned respect throughout the underground scene. Rebecca "The Beast" Johnson needed no introduction for most of the crowd. Her massive frame and intimidating presence made her look more like a professional wrestler than a fighter. She had earned her nickname by literally picking up opponents and throwing them around the ring like ragdolls. Finally, Big Mike called for the last fighter, and our final competitor, Maria Santos from East Los Angeles. The reaction from the crowd was immediate and brutal. Laughter echoed throughout the warehouse as Maria removed her hoodie and stepped into the fighting area. She looked like a child among giants, and many spectators began demanding their money back, assuming that Big Mike was running some kind of joke tournament. "Are you serious?" shouted one man from the bleachers. "That little girl is going to get killed in there." "This has to be some kind of mistake," called another voice. "She looks like she should be serving coffee, not fighting." Maria had expected this reaction, but hearing the laughter and ridicule still stung. She looked around at the crowd of faces, all of them dismissing her before she had even thrown a single punch. In that moment, she felt the same helplessness she had experienced as a child when bullies would corner her at school. But then she caught sight of her Uncle Ramon standing near the edge of the crowd. He wasn't laughing or shaking his head like everyone else. Instead, he was watching her with the same calm confidence he had shown during their training sessions. He nodded once, a simple gesture that reminded Maria of everything they had worked for over the past 5 years. The format of the tournament was simple but brutal. 6 fighters would be randomly paired for 3 preliminary fights. The 3 winners would then draw lots to determine who would get a bye to the final round, while the other 2 would fight in a semifinal. The tournament would continue until only 1 fighter remained standing. Big Mike reached into a hat and began drawing names for the first round of fights. The crowd held its breath as he announced the matchups, knowing that careers could be ended before the night was even half over. "First fight," Big Mike announced. "Jessica Martinez versus Sarah Chen." The crowd approved of this matchup. 2 skilled fighters with legitimate training backgrounds facing off in what promised to be a technical battle. Second fight, Carmen Rodriguez versus Rebecca Johnson. This pairing generated even more excitement, as it would pit speed and technique against raw power and aggression. And our final first-round fight. Big Mike paused for dramatic effect. Maria Santos versus Angela Thompson. The warehouse exploded with a mixture of laughter and genuine concern. Angela Thompson was not just undefeated in underground fighting. She was known for ending fights quickly and violently. Many of her previous opponents had required medical attention after facing her. Putting her against someone like Maria seemed less like a fight and more like an execution. Angela herself seemed annoyed by the matchup. She had come to the tournament expecting to face serious competition, not to waste her time with what appeared to be an amateur. She looked across the fighting area at Maria with a mixture of contempt and boredom. "This is going to be over in 30 seconds, Angela announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I didn't drive all the way from Detroit to beat up some waitress." The crowd laughed and cheered at her confidence, and the betting immediately became heavily skewed in Angela's favor. Bookies were offering odds of 20-1 against Maria, and even then, few people were willing to risk their money on such a long shot. Maria used the time before her fight to study Angela's movements and behavior. She watched how Angela carried herself, how she interacted with the crowd, and how she prepared for battle. What Maria saw was a fighter who had become accustomed to winning through intimidation and brute force. Angela was strong and experienced, but she was also overconfident and predictable. Ramon pulled his niece aside for a final strategy session before the fights began. They found a quiet corner of the warehouse where he could speak without being overheard by other fighters or spectators. "Remember everything we've practiced," he said, adjusting Maria's hand wraps one final time. "She's going to come at you hard and fast, trying to end it quickly. Let her exhaust herself in the first few minutes, then start picking her apart." Maria nodded, feeling the familiar calm that always came over her before a fight. The laughter and ridicule from the crowd had faded into background noise. All that mattered now was the training, the preparation, and the opportunity to prove that sometimes the smallest person in the room could be the most dangerous. As the first preliminary fight was about to begin, Maria took her position near the fighting area and prepared to watch her future opponents in action. She knew that everything she had worked for over the past 5 years would be decided in the next few hours. The first fight between Jessica Martinez and Sarah Chen began with the sound of Big Mike's whistle echoing through the warehouse. Both fighters immediately demonstrated why they had earned their reputations in the underground scene. Jessica moved, with the polished technique of a professional boxer, throwing crisp jabs and combinations that showcased years of formal training. Sarah responded with the fluid movements of a trained kickboxer, using her legs as weapons and maintaining distance with her superior reach. Maria watched intently from the sidelines, studying every movement and exchange. She noticed how Jessica, favored her right hand and telegraphed her power shots with a slight dip of her left shoulder. Sarah had a tendency to drop her guard after throwing high kicks, leaving herself vulnerable to counterattacks. These were the kinds of details that could mean the difference between victory and defeat. The fight lasted nearly 15 minutes, both women refusing to back down despite taking significant damage. Jessica's boxing skills eventually proved superior in the close-quarters exchanges, and she managed to score a decisive knockdown with a perfectly timed uppercut. Sarah tried to continue fighting, but the referee called an end to the bout when it became clear she was no longer able to defend herself properly. The second fight between Carmen Rodriguez and Rebecca Johnson was a complete contrast in styles. Rebecca immediately tried to use her size and strength advantage, rushing forward and attempting to overpower her smaller opponent. Carmen used her martial arts training to stay mobile, circling around the ring and picking her shots carefully. She landed several solid kicks to Rebecca's legs and body, gradually wearing down the larger woman. But Rebecca's power was devastating when she managed to connect. A single right hand caught Carmen off guard and sent her sprawling across the mat. Carmen managed to get back to her feet, but she was clearly hurt and struggling to maintain her balance. Rebecca pressed her advantage, eventually overwhelming Carmen with a series of heavy punches that forced a stoppage. As the first two fights concluded, the atmosphere in the warehouse had grown even more intense. The crowd had witnessed genuine violence and skill, raising expectations for the remaining bouts. Maria felt the nervous energy building around her as spectators began placing their bets for her fight against Angela Thompson. Big Mike announced a 15-minute break before the final preliminary fight, giving the fighters time to prepare and the crowd time to place their final wagers. Maria used this time to warm up, going through her stretching routine and throwing shadowboxing combinations in a quiet corner of the warehouse. Angela Thompson, meanwhile, was holding court with a group of admirers who had traveled from Detroit to watch her fight. She was telling stories about her previous victories, describing in graphic detail how she had defeated opponents who were supposedly much tougher than the little girl she was about to face. "I've been fighting in underground tournaments for 8 years," Angela boasted to her supporters. "I've beaten former military personnel, professional athletes, and street fighters who could bench press a car. This Maria girl is going to be the easiest payday of my career." The crowd around Angela laughed and cheered at her confidence. Several people approached her to ask for autographs and photos, treating her like a celebrity rather than a fighter preparing for battle. Angela clearly enjoyed the attention and seemed more focused on entertaining her fans than preparing for her upcoming opponent. Ramon noticed Angela's behavior and pointed it out to Maria during their final strategy discussion. "She's not taking you seriously," he observed. "That's going to be her biggest mistake. She's treating this like a guaranteed victory instead of preparing for a real fight." When Big Mike finally called for the fighters to enter the ring area, the contrast between the two women was striking. Angela entered first, flexing and posing for the crowd while trash-talking about how quickly she was going to end the fight. She stood nearly 6 feet tall, with a muscular build that spoke of years spent in prison gyms and underground fighting circuits. Maria entered quietly, ignoring the renewed laughter and ridicule from the spectators. She looked even smaller standing next to Angela, and many people in the crowd began shouting warnings about the mismatch they were about to witness. Some spectators even called for the fight to be canceled, claiming it was too dangerous for someone of Maria's size to face such an experienced opponent. "Last chance to back out, little girl," Angela said as they stood face to face in the center of the fighting area. "I don't want to hurt you too badly. Maybe you should go home and stick to serving coffee." Maria looked up at her opponent without expression. She had heard similar taunts throughout her life, and they no longer had the power to intimidate or discourage her. Instead, Angela's overconfidence was confirming everything that Maria and her uncle had suspected about her fighting style. Big Mike called both fighters to the center of the ring for final instructions. The rules were simple: no weapons, no intentional eye gouging, and the fight would continue until one fighter was knocked out, submitted, or unable to continue. There would be no rounds, no time limits, and no second chances. "Touch gloves and come out fighting," Big Mike instructed, though Angela made no move to show respect to her opponent. As the fighters returned to their corners for the final moments, Before battle, Maria caught sight of her reflection in a broken piece of mirror that had been propped against one of the warehouse walls. She saw herself as the crowd saw her, small, young, and seemingly out of place in this violent environment. But she also saw something else in her reflection, something that the crowd couldn't see from their seats in the makeshift bleachers. She saw 5 years of training with her uncle Ramon. She saw countless hours spent perfecting her technique, while other people her age were out having fun. She saw the determination of someone who had been underestimated her entire life and was finally ready to prove her worth. The warehouse fell silent as Big Mike raised his hand to signal the start of the fight. Hundreds of spectators held their breath, expecting to witness a quick and brutal beating. The betting had reached astronomical proportions, with almost everyone putting their money on Angela to win within the first minute. Angela bounced on her toes, eager to get started and add another victory to her perfect record. She had already decided how she was going to end the fight, planning to overwhelm Maria with a quick rush and finish things with a few powerful punches. In her mind, she was already counting the prize money and planning how she would celebrate after the tournament. Maria stood perfectly still, her breathing slow and controlled despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. She had visualized this moment countless times during her training, imagining how it would feel to face a bigger, stronger opponent in front of a hostile crowd. Now that the moment had arrived, she felt surprisingly calm and focused. The whistle blew, and 8 years of undefeated fighting experience rushed forward to meet 5 years of patient preparation and perfect technique. The crowd expected the fight to be over in seconds, but they were about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one nobody sees coming. The moment Big Mike's whistle pierced the air, Angela Thompson charged forward like a freight train, exactly as Maria had predicted. Her strategy was simple and brutal. Overwhelm the smaller fighter with pure aggression and end the fight before Maria could establish any kind of rhythm or defense. Angela threw a series of wild, powerful punches designed to connect with devastating force. But Maria wasn't there when the punches arrived. Moving with the fluid grace that 5 years of training had ingrained in her muscle memory, Maria slipped to the side and let Angela's momentum carry her past. The larger fighter stumbled slightly, confused by the lack of contact, and turned to find her opponent had somehow disappeared from where she expected her to be. The crowd's initial cheers turned to murmurs of surprise. They had expected to see Maria get overwhelmed immediately, but instead they were watching something entirely different unfold before their eyes. Angela reset herself and charged again, this time throwing a devastating right hook that would have ended the fight instantly if it had connected. Maria ducked under the punch so smoothly that it looked choreographed, then stepped to the outside and landed a quick jab to Angela's ribs before dancing away. The jab itself wasn't particularly powerful, but it was perfectly placed and timed. Angela felt a sharp pain in her side and realized that her opponent had actually hit her. This wasn't supposed to happen. In 8 years of underground fighting, Angela had never faced anyone who could move like this. "Stand still and fight," Angela shouted, frustration already creeping into her voice. Maria didn't respond with words. Instead, she continued to move around the fighting area with the patient confidence of someone who understood exactly what was happening. She had studied Angela's fighting style through the stories and videos that circulated in the underground scene, and everything was going according to plan. Angela was a powerful puncher, but she relied heavily on intimidation and early knockouts. She had never needed to develop the kind of technical skills that would allow her to defeat a mobile, defensive opponent. Her previous victories had all come against fighters who stood toe-to-toe with her and tried to match her aggression. As the first few minutes of the fight passed, a remarkable transformation began to occur in the warehouse. The laughter and ridicule from the crowd gradually faded into concentrated attention. People who had been joking about the mismatch were now leaning forward in their seats, trying to understand what they were witnessing. Maria continued to use her footwork to stay just outside of Angela's range, occasionally darting in to land quick, precise strikes before disappearing again. Each punch she threw was calculated and purposeful, targeting specific areas of Angela's body to gradually wear her down. A jab to the solar plexus made Angela's breathing slightly more labored. A quick hook to the kidney caused her to wince and drop her left hand momentarily. A perfectly timed uppercut caught Angela off guard and snapped her head back, drawing the first real blood of the fight. Angela's frustration was growing with each passing moment. She had expected to be celebrating her victory by now, but instead she found herself chasing an opponent who seemed to anticipate her every move. Her punches were becoming wilder and less controlled as she desperately tried to land something significant. "This is impossible," Angela muttered to herself between heavy breaths. "She's just a waitress." But Maria was demonstrating that she was much more than that. Every technique her Uncle Ramon had taught her was being executed with perfect precision. She was reading Angela's body language like a book, seeing the telegraphed punches coming from miles away and responding with counterpunches that found their mark consistently. The crowd was beginning to understand that they were witnessing something special. The betting odds that had heavily favored Angela were starting to shift as people recognized the technical superiority of the smaller fighter. Conversations that had been focused on how quickly Angela would win were now speculating about whether Maria might actually have a chance. Ramon watched from the sidelines with growing pride and excitement. He had always known that Maria possessed exceptional natural ability, but seeing her perform under this kind of pressure against such an experienced opponent was validation of everything they had worked toward. As the fight entered its second phase, Angela's conditioning began to become a factor. She had always relied on ending fights quickly, and her training had focused more on power than endurance. The constant movement and the frustration of being unable to land clean shots were taking their toll on both her body and her mental state. Maria, meanwhile, looked as fresh as she had at the beginning of the fight. Her breathing was controlled, her movements remained crisp and precise, and she showed no signs of fatigue despite maintaining constant motion for nearly 10 minutes. Angela decided to change tactics, attempting to corner Maria against the rope boundary of the fighting area. She threw a series of punches designed not necessarily to knock Maria out, but to limit her mobility and force her into a stationary exchange where Angela's size advantage would be decisive. For a moment, it looked like the strategy might work. Maria found herself pressed against the rope with Angela closing in, throwing heavy punches with bad intentions. The crowd held its breath, expecting to finally see the devastating finish they had anticipated. But Maria had trained for exactly this scenario. Instead of panicking or trying to power her way out of the corner, she waited for the perfect moment. When Angela committed to a massive overhand right that would have ended the fight, Maria ducked low and spun away, causing Angela to punch nothing but air and lose her balance. As Angela stumbled forward, trying to catch herself, Maria struck with the precision of a surgeon. A perfectly placed hook caught Angela behind the ear, and for the first time in her underground fighting career, Angela Thompson found herself on the ground. The warehouse erupted in shock and amazement. People who had been laughing at Maria just minutes earlier were now on their feet, cheering for the impossible comeback they were witnessing. Angela struggled to get back to her feet, shaking her head to clear the cobwebs from the unexpected knockdown. "This can't be happening," Angela said to herself as she rose unsteadily. Not to me. Not against her. But it was happening, and Maria was just getting started. As Angela regained her footing, she could see something in her opponent's eyes that she had never encountered before. It wasn't anger or aggression, but a calm, calculating confidence that suggested Maria had been waiting for this moment her entire life. The fight that was supposed to be over in 30 seconds had now stretched beyond 15 minutes, and the momentum had completely shifted. Angela was hurt, tired, and for the first time in her career, genuinely afraid of losing to someone she had completely underestimated. Maria stood in the center of the fighting area, waiting patiently for Angela to fully recover. She wasn't interested in taking advantage of a hurt opponent. She wanted to prove her superiority definitively and completely. The crowd could sense that something historic was happening, and the energy in the warehouse had reached a fever pitch. Angela Thompson had never experienced anything like this in her 8-year fighting career. As she steadied herself against the makeshift ropes, wiping blood from her nose, she looked across at Maria with a mixture of disbelief and growing respect. The little waitress she had planned to demolish in 30 seconds had just knocked her down with a perfectly timed punch that she never saw coming. The crowd was in complete chaos. People who had bet against Maria were shouting in disbelief, while others who had taken the long odds were celebrating wildly. The transformation in the warehouse atmosphere was remarkable. What had started as a joke had become the most compelling fight anyone present had ever witnessed. "Get up, Angela," shouted one of her supporters from Detroit.
"Don't let her embarrass you like this."
But Angela was beginning to understand that embarrassment was the least of her concerns. As she studied Maria's stance and movement, she realized she was facing a level of technical skill that she had never encountered before. Every punch Maria threw was calculated. Every movement had purpose, and her defensive abilities were making Angela look like an amateur. Maria waited patiently for Angela to fully recover, her hands up and ready but showing no urgency to press her advantage. This was another aspect of her fighting style that impressed the knowledgeable observers in the crowd. Many fighters would have rushed in to finish a hurt opponent, but Maria understood that patience and timing were more valuable than aggression. "You're better than I thought," Angela admitted as she prepared to continue the fight. "But I didn't come here to lose to someone half my size." "Size doesn't matter," Maria replied quietly, speaking for the first time since the fight began. "Skill matters." Angela came forward again, but this time with more caution and respect for her opponent's abilities. She had abandoned her strategy of overwhelming Maria with brute force, and was now trying to use her experience and intelligence to find an opening. The next several minutes showcased two completely different approaches to fighting. Angela used her size and strength to try to control the pace, attempting to tie Maria up in clinches and wear her down with physical pressure. Maria continued to rely on her superior footwork and technique, landing clean shots while avoiding Angela's attempts to turn the fight into a brawling contest. What amazed the crowd was Maria's composure under pressure. When Angela managed to grab her and push her against the ropes, Maria didn't panic or try to muscle her way out. Instead, she used short, precise punches to target Angela's body and break free when the opportunity presented itself. As the fight progressed, the technical disparity between the two fighters became increasingly obvious. Angela's punches, while powerful, were becoming increasingly wild and desperate. Maria's strikes, meanwhile, were landing with metronomic precision, each one serving a specific purpose in her overall strategy. A left hook to Angela's liver caused her to double over momentarily. A right cross caught her flush on the chin and made her legs wobble. An uppercut found its way through Angela's guard and snapped her head back violently. Each punch was delivered with perfect technique and devastating accuracy. The crowd was witnessing a masterclass in boxing fundamentals. Maria was demonstrating that proper training and technique could overcome significant advantages in size and experience. Her uncle Ramon watched from the sidelines with tears of pride in his eyes, seeing years of patient instruction being executed flawlessly under the most challenging circumstances. By the 20-minute mark of the fight, Angela was clearly in trouble. Her face was swollen and bloodied, her breathing was labored, and her movements had slowed considerably. The undefeated fighter who had entered the warehouse with such confidence was now struggling to mount any meaningful offense against an opponent she had completely underestimated. Maria, meanwhile, looked as if she could fight for another hour. Her conditioning was excellent, her technique remained sharp, and her confidence was growing with each successful exchange. She had proven to herself and everyone watching that she belonged in this environment. "I can't believe what I'm seeing," said one spectator to his friend. "That little girl is beating Angela Thompson like she's a beginner." "This is going to change everything," replied his companion. "Nobody's going to underestimate fighters based on size anymore." Angela attempted one final desperate rush, throwing everything she had left in a last-ditch effort to turn the fight around. She came forward with wild, looping punches that had knockout power behind them, hoping to catch Maria with a lucky shot that would save her perfect record. But Maria was ready for the desperation attack. She slipped the first punch, ducked under the second, and stepped to the side of the third. As Angela's momentum carried her forward, Maria planted her feet and threw a picture-perfect right cross that caught Angela perfectly on the jaw. The impact of the punch echoed through the warehouse like a gunshot. Angela's eyes rolled back, her knees buckled, and she crashed to the ground like a felled tree. The crowd erupted in complete pandemonium as the undefeated underground legend lay motionless on the canvas. Big Mike began counting, but it was clear that Angela wasn't getting up. The woman who had dominated underground fighting circuits for 8 years had been knocked unconscious by someone who weighed barely 100 pounds and had never fought professionally before. 10. "It's over," Big Mike announced. "Maria Santos wins by knockout." The warehouse exploded with noise as people struggled to process what they had just witnessed. The impossible had happened. The biggest underdog in underground fighting history had just defeated one of the most feared competitors in the sport. Maria stood over her fallen opponent, not in triumph or celebration, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had finally proven what she had always known about herself. She had spent her entire life being dismissed and underestimated, and now she had undeniable proof that those judgments had been wrong. Ramon rushed into the fighting area and embraced his niece, both of them overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just occurred. The quiet girl who worked double shifts at a diner had just announced herself as a legitimate force in the underground fighting world. As medical personnel attended to Angela, who was slowly regaining consciousness, the crowd began to realize that they had witnessed something historic. Word of this fight would spread throughout the underground scene, and Maria Santos would never again be underestimated by anyone. But the night wasn't over yet. Maria had won her preliminary fight, but there were still two more opponents standing between her and the tournament championship. Jessica Martinez and Rebecca Johnson had also advanced to the semifinals, and both of them had been watching Maria's performance with growing concern. What had started as a joke tournament featuring an obvious victim had become something entirely different. Maria Santos was no longer the underdog. She was the fighter that everyone else feared facing. The warehouse was still buzzing with excitement 30 minutes after Maria's stunning victory over Angela Thompson. Medical personnel had helped Angela to her feet and confirmed that she had no serious injuries beyond her wounded pride. As word of the upset spread through the crowd, people were pulling out their phones to record videos and share the news with friends who had missed the fight. Big Mike called for order as the tournament format required determining the semifinal matchups. According to the rules, the three winners would draw lots to see who would receive a bye directly to the final, while the other two would fight in the semifinal round. Jessica Martinez and Rebecca Johnson stood with Maria as Big Mike held up 3 pieces of paper. Both veteran fighters were looking at Maria with entirely different expressions than they had worn at the beginning of the evening. The laughter and dismissal had been replaced by genuine concern and respect. "I've been fighting for 12 years, Jessica whispered to Rebecca as they waited for the draw. "I've never seen anyone move like that. She made Angela look like an amateur." Rebecca nodded in agreement, her usual confidence shaken by what she had witnessed. "Did you see how calm she was? Even when Angela had her cornered, she never panicked. That's not normal for someone fighting their first underground bout." When Big Mike announced the results of the draw, a collective gasp went through the crowd. Maria had drawn the bye to the final, meaning she would have to wait and see which of the 2 remaining fighters would join her in the championship bout. "This is perfect," Ramon said to his niece as they found a quiet corner to rest and prepare for the final. "You get time to recover while they have to fight each other. By the time you face the winner, they'll be tired and possibly injured." Maria nodded, but her mind was already analyzing the strengths and weaknesses of both potential opponents. Jessica was technically sound with excellent boxing fundamentals, but she relied heavily on combinations and might struggle against Maria's defensive movement. Rebecca was incredibly strong and had shown good endurance, but her fighting style was somewhat predictable, and she had a tendency to telegraph her power shots. The semi-final fight between Jessica and Rebecca began 20 minutes later, and it immediately became clear that both fighters were concerned about facing Maria in the final. They fought with unusual caution, either wanting to take unnecessary risks that might leave them vulnerable in the championship bout. Jessica used her superior boxing technique to control the early minutes of the fight, landing clean jabs and staying away from Rebecca's power. She had clearly studied Rebecca's previous fight and was determined not to get caught in the kind of brawling exchange that Rebecca preferred. Rebecca, meanwhile, was trying to pace herself while still applying enough pressure to win the fight. She had seen how Maria's conditioning had been a factor against Angela, and she didn't want to exhaust herself in the semi-final, only to face a fresh opponent in the final. The contrast between this fight and Maria's earlier bout was striking. Both Jessica and Rebecca were experienced, accomplished fighters, but their bout lacked the technical brilliance that Maria had displayed. They were fighting not to lose rather than fighting to win, and the crowd could sense the difference. As the semi-final progressed, Maria continued her analysis of both fighters. She noticed that Jessica dropped her right hand slightly after throwing her jab, creating an opening for a counter left hook. Rebecca had a habit of backing straight up when pressured. which could be exploited by cutting off the ring and forcing her into corners. The semifinal fight lasted nearly 25 minutes before Jessica managed to secure a victory through superior conditioning and technique. Rebecca had put up a valiant effort, but the sustained pressure from Jessica's boxing skills eventually wore her down, and she was stopped after taking a series of unanswered punches in the final minutes. As Jessica was declared the winner, she immediately looked across the warehouse to where Maria was sitting with her uncle. The expression on Jessica's face was unmistakable. She was genuinely afraid of what she was about to face in the final. "I never thought I'd be worried about fighting someone who weighs 100 pounds. Jessica confided to her corner team during the break before the final. "But after watching her destroy Angela, I'm not sure what to expect." The crowd was already anticipating the final bout with unprecedented excitement. Many of the people who had come to watch Angela Thompson dominate the tournament were now completely invested in Maria's story. The quiet waitress from East Los Angeles had captured their imagination in a way that nobody could have predicted. Big Mike took his time setting up the final, understanding that this was likely to be the most memorable fight he had ever organized. The betting had shifted dramatically since the beginning of the evening, with Maria now favored to win, despite being the smallest competitor in the tournament. As the fighters prepared for the championship bout, Ramon pulled Maria aside for their final strategy session of the night. "Jessica is technically very good," he said, "but she's also tired from her fight with Rebecca. She's going to try to use her experience to control the pace and keep you at a distance. Don't let her dictate the terms of the fight." Maria listened carefully to her uncle's advice, but she was already forming her own strategy based on what she had observed during the semifinal. Jessica was indeed skilled, but she was also predictable in her approach. More importantly, she was fighting scared, which meant she would be hesitant to take the risks necessary to defeat someone with Maria's defensive abilities. "I know what to do," Maria said quietly. "She's going to try to box me from the outside, but she's tired and her footwork isn't as good as mine. I can force her into exchanges where my speed advantage will matter more than her experience." As the final preparations were made, word of the tournament had begun to spread beyond the warehouse. Social media posts about the upset were generating significant attention, and people who had never heard of underground fighting were asking questions about the young woman who was dismantling established fighters. The atmosphere in the warehouse was electric as Big Mike called both fighters to the center of the ring area for the final bout. Jessica looked nervous and uncertain, constantly glancing at Maria as if trying to solve a puzzle she couldn't understand. Maria appeared calm and focused, showing no signs of fatigue despite having already fought for over 20 minutes earlier in the evening. "Ladies and gentlemen," Big Mike announced through his megaphone, "this is the final bout of tonight's tournament. The winner takes home $25,000 and the recognition as the best female underground fighter on the West Coast." The crowd cheered wildly as both fighters returned to their corners for the final moments before the championship bout. Jessica's team was giving her last-minute advice about dealing with Maria's movement, while Ramon was simply reminding his niece to stay patient and trust her training. As the whistle prepared to signal the start of the final fight, Maria looked around the warehouse one more time. Hours earlier, these same people had been laughing at her and placing bets on how quickly she would be defeated. Now they were on their feet, cheering for the underdog who had already exceeded everyone's expectations. But Maria knew that her biggest test was still ahead of her. Jessica Martinez was a legitimate fighter with years of professional experience. Winning the tournament would require Maria to elevate her performance even higher than she had against Angela Thompson. The whistle blew, and the championship fight began. The final fight began with Jessica Martinez employing a completely different strategy than any of Maria's previous opponents. Instead of rushing forward or trying to overwhelm with power, Jessica maintained distance and attempted to use her professional boxing experience to control the pace of the fight. She threw measured jabs, moved laterally, and tried to establish a rhythm that would allow her to dictate the terms of engagement. For the first few minutes, Jessica's strategy appeared to be working. She was landing clean shots while avoiding Maria's counters, and her superior reach was keeping the smaller fighter at bay. The crowd watched nervously, wondering if Maria had finally met her match in a technically superior opponent. But Maria was studying Jessica's patterns with the same analytical precision she had used against Angela Thompson. She noticed that Jessica's jabs always came in groups of 2 or 3, followed by a predictable lateral movement to her right. Jessica's conditioning was also becoming a factor, as the semifinal fight had taken more out of her than she had anticipated. As the fight progressed into its second phase, Maria began to make subtle adjustments to her approach. Instead of trying to force aggressive exchanges, she started using her superior footwork to gradually cut off Jessica's escape routes. Every time Jessica moved to her right, Maria was there to meet her with precise counterpunches. The turning point came when Jessica attempted a combination that had worked well against Rebecca Johnson. She threw a jab cross-hook sequence and immediately moved to her right to avoid a counterattack. But Maria had been waiting for exactly this pattern. Instead of following the combination, she anticipated Jessica's movement and was waiting with a perfectly timed right cross when Jessica moved into her path. The punch caught Jessica flush on the jaw and immediately changed the dynamic of the fight. Jessica's legs wobbled, her hands dropped momentarily, and for the first time all evening she looked genuinely hurt. The crowd erupted in excitement, sensing that another upset might be imminent. Maria didn't rush to capitalize on Jessica's momentary vulnerability. Instead, she continued her patient approach, gradually increasing the pressure while maintaining her defensive responsibilities. She had learned from watching other fighters that rushed attacks often led to mistakes, and she was determined not to let overconfidence cost her the championship. Jessica tried to recover by returning to her boxing fundamentals, but her confidence had been shaken by Maria's counterpunch. She began fighting more defensively, spending more energy on avoiding damage than on trying to win the fight. This played directly into Maria's hands as it allowed her to control the pace and gradually wear down her opponent. As the final fight entered its third phase, the technical superiority that Maria had displayed throughout the tournament became increasingly evident. Her punches were landing with clockwork precision, while Jessica's shots were becoming increasingly desperate and inaccurate. The professional boxer who had entered the final as the favorite was being systematically dismantled by someone who had learned to fight in an old gym in East Los Angeles. "This is incredible," one spectator shouted to his friend. "She's making Jessica look like an amateur too." "How is this possible?" "I don't know," his companion replied, "but we're watching something special here. This girl is going to be famous after tonight." The crowd was completely absorbed in the technical clinic they were witnessing. Maria's performance was a masterpiece of defensive boxing, combined with perfectly timed offensive strikes. She was demonstrating that size, experience, and reputation meant nothing compared to superior skill and preparation. Jessica attempted one final desperate rally, throwing everything she had left in a series of wild combinations designed to catch Maria off guard. But Maria was ready for the desperation attack. She slipped the first combination, countered the second, and then stepped forward to deliver the decisive blow. The final punch of the fight was a left uppercut that caught Jessica perfectly under the chin as she was backing away from a missed right hand. The impact lifted Jessica off her feet and sent her crashing to the canvas in a heap. Unlike Angela's knockdown, which had been the result of accumulated damage, this knockout was instant and devastating. Big Mike began his count, but it was clear that Jessica would not be getting up. The professional boxer lay unconscious on the canvas while the crowd erupted in the loudest celebration of the evening. Maria Santos, the quiet waitress from East Los Angeles, had just won the underground fighting tournament by defeating 6 experienced fighters in a single night. As Big Mike reached 10 and declared Maria the winner, she stood in the center of the fighting area, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had accomplished. The crowd that had been laughing at her just hours earlier was now giving her a standing ovation, recognizing that they had witnessed something truly extraordinary. Ramon rushed into the ring and embraced his niece, both of them crying tears of joy and relief. 5 years of training, sacrifice, and preparation had culminated in this moment of triumph. Maria had proven definitively that she was not just a competent fighter, but one of the most skilled competitors in the underground scene. As Big Mike presented Maria with the $25,000 prize, photographers and video cameras captured every moment. Word of her performance was already spreading beyond the warehouse, and Maria's story was becoming the kind of legend that fighters would talk about for years to come. "Ladies and gentlemen," Big Mike announced to the crowd, "I've been organizing underground fights for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what we witnessed tonight. Maria Santos didn't just win this tournament, she dominated it against opponents who were supposed to be in completely different leagues. The other fighters, who had been defeated earlier in the evening, approached Maria to congratulate her and ask for advice. Angela Thompson, her pride wounded but her respect genuine, shook Maria's hand and admitted that she had learned valuable lessons from their fight. As the crowd began to disperse and the warehouse returned to its normal state of abandonment, Maria sat with her uncle and contemplated what had just happened. In a single evening, she had transformed from an unknown waitress into one of the most talked-about fighters in the underground scene. "What happens now?" Maria asked her uncle as they prepared to leave the warehouse. "Now," Ramon replied with a smile, "nobody will ever underestimate you again, but more importantly, you've proven to yourself that you can accomplish anything you set your mind to. This is just the beginning." As they walked out of the warehouse and into the early morning light, Maria carried with her not just the prize money, but something far more valuable: the absolute certainty that she was capable of achieving things that others considered impossible. The quiet girl who had been dismissed and overlooked, her entire life had found her voice through the precision of her fists and the power of her determination. The story of Maria Santos would be told and retold throughout the underground fighting community, inspiring other fighters who felt underestimated and dismissed. But for Maria herself, the victory was not an end but a beginning. The first chapter in a story that would prove that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one nobody sees coming.